Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for being
Hi,
with me today.
such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so happy you're here. And we've been talking a little bit on Instagram, and it's all things ADHD and traveling. But first, before we get into it, I'm hoping that you could just give a quick intro, talk about your area of focus, your practice, and what kind of led you to this area of focus.
Yeah, so like Kim said, my name's Andrew. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I both have ADHD and specialize in treating it. So my own journey, I was diagnosed when I was 6 years old. I was very fortunate. I was like a little pinball machine. So they're like, obviously ADHD, obviously. So I had a lot of the right supports and resources and tools. And it eventually led me into the path of mental health. As I got older, new issues came up, new struggles came up, and I wanted support. I found it didn't really exist, and it made me think, like, why aren't there more adult therapists for ADHD? So I started specializing, studying it, learning about it. I did trainings, I've read almost a dozen books at this point, and it's just really become a hyperfixation, for lack of a better word. I really think putting ADHD in the forefront has so much power and potential. And
Yeah.
when Kim reached out to me and is like, "Hey, you want to talk about ADHD and travel?" I'm like, "Oh, I love it." I just came off a couple months of travel myself, so I'm like in that mindset. So I'm so excited to talk more about it.
Well, I'm happy that you're here, and I'm happy we're talking about it because when we were kind of leading up to this conversation, as I'd mentioned, my son has some ADHD kind of underlining areas that we're working on. But I think for me, there's a lot of misconceptions about ADHD. So I'm
Hmm.
just hoping that you can kind of give me like and everyone watching an overview of what is ADHD.
Oh, that is such a good question. So I grew up in the 90s. To give some background on this, I am very comfortable and aware of the stigma that still exists within ADHD. We were just told we're hyper little kids who can't sit still, and it is so much more nuanced than that. So if you look at what Russell Barkley, one of the leading experts, says, call it more of an executive functioning regulation disorder. So executive functioning, it's our ability to do higher level functions in the more newer parts of our brain. So what does this include? This includes things like impulse control, hyperactivity, impulsivity. We know this, that's nothing new. But this also includes things like time management. How long
Mhm.
is time passing? How much time do I have to actually do something? How long will something take? Planning and prioritization. If you have a big project, you have to break that big project down into small, manageable steps. In ADHD brains, we have trouble breaking those steps down. More executive functions include things like emotional regulation. Our emotions are bigger, they last longer, we get stuck in them more. This is things like all of those that I just listed, right? So, the challenge where the misunderstanding I think comes from, to add to your question, is that we are just seen as those hyper little kids. And so, as a result, not only are we misunderstanding it, we're minimizing the severity it has. Not to be gloom and doom, but untreated ADHD takes years off your life, up to 13 years
Mm.
off your lifespan. It is very important that we don't trivialize it down to a little fidgety kid. And so, and I could go on, but I think that's the shortest answer I could give as to what ADHD really is.
No, that's great. And I think in the last recent years, I would say coming out of the pandemic, like we are getting more diagnoses around ADHD and
Hmm.
focus. And I think it's so important because I also remember I have a brother who's 11 years younger than I am, kind of probably the same age as you. And he struggled in school and it was always behavioral. He can't sit still. He has issues and, with behavior and challenges there. And I think it's helping parents now. And I also think helping the kids know that like this is the reason why my brain is doing this or or I'm acting
Hmm.
this way. And I think that's so important. So
Yeah,
thank
I
you for the
mean,
work that you're doing.
of course. And like exactly what you said. So many kids have to internalize this message of I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. And the amount of people I see that say, I spent years thinking I was defective, and the emotional
Yeah.
turmoil that it takes, it's important that we normalize things like accommodations, like making it comfortable for a kiddo with ADHD to travel when they're overstimulated. Like, we have to normalize that space.
Yeah. So, segueing into travel. So, travel in general, traveling to Disneyland or Disney World. How can we help as parents? How can we help our kiddos like be able to take a long plane ride, sit in the car, know that they're going to a place where it's going to be kind of loud, and how do we prepare for travel just in general?
Yeah. First thing is most important to recognize what are the general sensory or mental health issues that we're going to run into, right? Every
Hmm.
kid's a little different. When I was a kid, my parents had to let me run up and down the aisles. Probably not feasible anymore on a plane, but like you think of, is there going to be, are we going to be understimulated? Is there going to be a risk for the kiddo to be hyperactive? Is the kiddo sensory sensitive? Are there
Hmm.
sound issues? Are there smell issues? Are there texture issues? What are those issues? First and foremost, y'all are going to know your kiddos better than anyone else. Know what the barriers are and accommodate for them. Maybe you get noise dampening headphones. Maybe you have a little extra screen time that day, right? What is going to keep the stimulation constant enough to do this? The other part is, how do you reinforce good behavior and what are natural consequences for behaviors we want to reduce?
Yeah.
So, the example, your kid is going, maybe your kiddo's at that age where they're testing boundaries. Maybe they're at that age where no is their favorite word, right? Like, so what is your kiddo going to be like? And how do you give them the supports that they need? Um, some people talk about having like a good token economy in place where you use points, chips, rewards to reinforce good behaviors with tangible rewards, natural consequences and negative point removal for things that don't go well, right? Have a plan, have a structure, and stick to that structure. Reinforce when it works, respond accordingly when it doesn't. Accommodate sensory needs. Those are my big tips for travel, and that's what helps me to this day is accommodating sensory needs.
Yeah. I think like Disney in general, it is a bit of sensory overload. So my advice to that is there's a lot of places that you can take breaks, like specifically, like at Disneyland, specifically Tom Sawyer's Island, get on the raft, go over there and let your child just kind of run around and take it in. I do think that when you can accommodate for those kind of breaks, I do think that's going to be helpful. What are some other potentially challenges that parents may need to work through in the moment, or maybe being like a trigger that they're seeing? And how can you help parents proactively work through any of those challenges in a crowded space, maybe waiting in line for rides and so on?
In the kiddo, like if the kiddo is going to have that reaction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, number one, I ask that because like you want to
Yeah.
make sure that you're prepared. You yourself as a parent are mentally prepared to handle that. As a parent of a kiddo with neurodiversity, recognize that you already
Hmm.
have higher stress levels. So at baseline, you want to make sure that you've developed good responses when your kid gets dysregulated. I have learned that personally. It is hard to regulate when your kid is unregulated. You may have your own
Yeah.
neurodiversity yourself. It tends to be genetic, so you might be struggling with your own sensory issues. Things that you can do to maintain and prepare for that. You know your kid. You know when your kid's getting bored. You know situations that lead to common triggers. If you don't know that,
Hmm.
it may be good to work to identify that either with your kiddo themselves through therapy, but understand what your kid is more likely to get overstimulated or dysregulated from in the first place, and what things tend to help them in those settings, right? It's like I'm not going to put a T-baller in the major leagues. Don't take your kiddo to a big theme park if they've never been in a big crowd before. Give
Yeah.
them situations to learn how to accommodate and regulate. But like standing in line sucks. Um, that one's hard. So if you can afford it, if you can swing it, I know there's fast passes. That's what we did when I was a kid. If that's a
Yeah.
financially viable option, it's worth the investment. You get in more rides at baseline, but also you avoid the longer waits. But if you can't, make sure your phone's charged and have some games ready to go, have some things ready to do, have some ways to maintain stimulation. Is there
Hmm.
room for them to walk around or wander in the line? Is there things you can do that engage them? Scavenger hunts, games, things of that nature. But be prepared to respond in those situations in ways that you have previously had success with. That's usually what I would recommend.
Yeah. Do you work with parents, and then also how do you help just support parents overall with like the overwhelming feeling of potentially big things happening in the child's life? Like,
Yeah. Well, yeah,
okay.
I do work with parents, right? It's like when you're going through that point of dysregulation yourself, it's
Yeah.
again that idea of like, how do I personally regulate? Because neurodivergent or not, a kid being like it's that like visceral panic that you only know as a parent of like,
Yeah.
oh my god, what is happening? I can't control my kid. Everyone's looking at me. I'm embarrassed. What do I do? Then that panic starts to bleed into your response to the kid. If that panic isn't controlled or you don't have a way to cope with it, then you're going to have trouble responding to anything that your kid does with the ideas that we talk about, right? So, as a parent, know your triggers, know how you deal with bigger emotional dysregulation, and how do you challenge yourself in the moment. I lean heavily into they're just a kid, they can't help it so much
Yeah.
because we often get into that trap of, I expect this kid to be able to respond like I would. They
Hmm.
can't. Kids with ADHD tend to be 2 to 3 years younger developmentally than
Yeah.
someone without it. So, like, you're trying to work with a kid who's 2 years younger than the age they actually should be. So, like, all these things are things you know whether you're traveling or not. It's just now it's on very much a magnified level. The dial's at an 11 now. So, how do I regulate enough? And so that could be a whole separate conversation of developing coping skills, right? And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how I recommend it. You got to have the ability to put on your own oxygen mask before you can help anyone else put on theirs.
Yeah. I think what's really important, and what I've kind of been the underlining theme with a lot of experts that I've talked to, is like, this is really traveling with your child is parenting in a different location.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like setting your expectations that things are going to probably go out the window. Like, it's good to have a plan, but things you have to be able to be flexible. But
Right.
it's being able to, like you said, put on your oxygen mask first, and you have to kind of regulate before you get into that mode of like, trying to scold your child for constantly climbing on railings at Disneyland or whatever it is. Like, it's hard. It's hard.
Right. And those are
And
value challenges, right? Like how important to me really is it that they're doing this? Like at the end of the day, how much do I define myself based on what this kid's doing? It
yeah,
shouldn't be much, right? It's still a good
yeah.
parent if your kid climbs on things.
Yeah, because I think a lot of like having a neurodivergent child, you spend a lot of time as a parent, well, at least for me, is like looking inward of like, how could I have done that better? You know, we are a constant work in progress being a parent baseline. And then working through this is like another area of like, you're still learning. I'm still learning. I'm still learning about my son, all of those things. Um, what would you say, or any suggestions that you can give to parents that are thinking of a trip? Like any kind of tips, anything that you can give, just to share like a trip is possible.
Yeah. I mean, prepare for that trip. right?
Mhm.
Start practicing going into bigger crowds, into bigger settings that may be a little more difficult, but closer to home. You have a safe home base to return to. You have a safe place to practice regulating. You have your home base resources at your disposal. Family can come tag you out if you get too overwhelmed yourself, right? Practice going out. Like if you're going on a trip and you're going to go eat out a lot, the first time your kids should eat out should not be on that trip. They should have some preparation, some practice, so you know how they're going to respond. Stand in lines, wait in places, do things where this reaction from your kiddo is going to be tested.
Mhm.
You'll at least at a minimum know what to expect. And the thing is, I, as someone with ADHD, I did all of these things. I went to amusement parks and I loved them. I've traveled and I loved it. It is possible for someone with ADHD to travel.
Mhm.
It's just how much can you control, do what you can, and react for yourself in what ways you can control.
Yeah. Um, you touched on a little bit, like kind of as a parent tapping out, maybe they need a break, and maybe, going to a place like Disney, sometimes it's really great if you can bring a grandparent or
Mm.
an aunt or an uncle to help. Um, how can you help equip as a parent, talk to like my mom about, hey, these are some little things that we're working through. Like, what are some tips that you can give parents telling extended family of working through like an ADHD child and challenges?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on your relationship with that parent. How
Mhm.
responsive are they, or how much are they like, yeah, I'm going to do my own thing anyway, right? Like, um, I think generally speaking, show them what you want them to do.
Yeah.
Show them like this is how we're going to respond in this moment. Model it. Make sure that they understand it. Make sure that they don't have any questions or interpret what you said differently. You
Hmm.
may think you're being clear in communication, and then they're like, you come back and your kid's holding a big old thing of cotton candy that you never wanted them to have, and you're like, right?
Mm.
So, like, make sure,
Grandma's here. Grandma's going to
yeah.
get anything that the kid wants.
Well, of course, it's grandma time. Grandma can do what grandma wants because that's what grandmas are for, right? Like,
Totally.
you know, have those good, clear boundaries and expectations communicated and set ahead of time. In that way, it's the same idea of know what you need in that moment. Just as much as you need to have a good plan, you need to be able to make sure everyone on board has the same base level of understanding of that plan. But like you've said, plans are going to go wrong and what you communicate may not be well received.
Yeah.
Define for yourself how important that reception of that thing being received is. If if it's like vital, then drive it home and drill it until the cows go home. If it's not vital, explain it. Give yourself space to know that it's going to be okay if it doesn't work out.
Yeah. I think sometimes, like we talked about parenting in a different location, I think it's also about resetting expectations when you're on a vacation. Things kind of go out the
Mhm.
window. You
Yeah.
know, your kid may
Mhm.
eat a bag of cotton candy or a churro or, and maybe you wouldn't have your child eat that on a daily basis, but you're on vacation. So I think it's also kind of
Right.
like resetting your own expectations as a parent of like things are going to happen. It's
Yep.
vacation. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, it's, it's it's hard planning a trip and the overwhelming but I think it's important that we're sharing the message of like travel is possible for
Yeah.
ADHD kids, adults, young adults, individual. It is possible. The planning is key, and kind of resetting expectations. Any final thoughts that you would like to share? Suggestions, comments?
Yeah, I mean, think of it like this. Some of my best memories as a kid were when I got to travel. I loved going to amusement parks. I loved going on roller coasters. I loved traveling, right? And you are struggling so much as a parent to advocate, fight, and do for your kiddo everything they need to be comfortable. But remember the experiences that make you feel just like a parent with a kid. That's really all you are, is a parent with a kid. have fun, right? Disney is such a cool place and you can have so much fun there. ADHD is just coming along for the ride. You're going to have a
Yeah.
good time. It's going to be a good trip. You're going to be okay. And just remind yourself that however long your trip is, at the end of that trip, whatever happened in between is totally up to you as far as how you internalize the experience. So if
Yeah.
you let the little things get to you, then it's going to be a bad time. If you go with the flow, take things as they come, you're going to have a good time. And it's all
Yeah.
about your perspective.
Totally. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for being with me.
Oh, it
Where
was
can
such a
people find
pleasure.
you?
I
Yeah.
am on, yeah, so you can find me at Neurospicy Counseling on Instagram and on TikTok and on Threads. Um, and yeah, those are my platforms.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much, Kim.